Dorset, September 1816. The engagement had been arranged by Lady Atherstone, which meant it had been arranged with the certainty of a woman who considered uncertainty a personal failing, and had spent 30 years eliminating it from polite society. The Duke of Haldane required a wife of fortune. The Verlaine family had a daughter of extraordinary capability and considerable wealth. The match, Lady Atherstone had informed both families, was not a suggestion. It was an inevitability she was merely accelerating. The engagement was announced in August. By September, Corisande Verlaine had been a betrothed woman for 6 weeks, had visited Haldane Hall twice, and had formed a detailed understanding of every room in the house except the one that mattered, which was the room inside the man she was expected to marry. She was going to see that room tonight. The engagement dinner had been set for the 14th of September at Haldane Hall. 40 guests, the full weight of Dorset society arranged around a table, to witness what Lady Atherstone considered a settled matter. Corisande arrived with her father in a borrowed carriage because the Verlaine fortune was in mills and land and ledgers, not in lacquered doors and matched horses. She wore dark blue, well-made, the kind of dress that communicated seriousness without apology, and she carried in her posture the composed attention of a woman who had been her father's sole partner in business since she was 15, and had never once entered a room she had not already measured. She was seated beside the Duke at the head of the table, which was where a future Duchess was placed, and which was also, she understood, a position designed for display rather than conversation. He was handsome in the way that men of old title often were, the architecture of generations visible in the jaw, the quality of stillness that came from never having been required to prove anything. She had noted this at both previous meetings and set it aside. What she had not yet assessed was what lived beneath the stillness. She was about to. The evening moved through its first courses with the practiced efficiency of a house that had been hosting these occasions for 200 years. The conversation was managed, the wine was excellent, and the Duke conducted the table with the quiet authority of a man who understood his role and performed it without visible effort. Lady Atherstone, seated 4 places down, watched the pair with the focused satisfaction of a woman reviewing a project on schedule. It was during the 3rd course that Lady Trevon, seated across the table, turned to the Duke and said, "You must be delighted to be settled again, Your Grace." The table shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that only someone paying close attention would notice, and Corisande was paying close attention. The Duke set down his glass. "I am pleased to have the matter resolved," he said. Corisande heard the word resolved. She heard it the way she heard numbers in a ledger that did not quite balance. She stored it. The dinner concluded. The guests moved to the drawing room, and in the transit between the 2 rooms, the Duke fell into step beside her and said, without looking at her, "There is a matter I wish to discuss privately." She looked at him. His profile in the corridor light was composed and entirely unreadable. "Of course," she said. They were given the library. It was a room she had not seen on her previous visits, which meant he had not considered her worth showing the room where he actually lived. The books were in good order. The desk was used. There was a letter half-written beside the lamp, the ink not yet dry, which meant he had been in here before the dinner, working, while 40 people gathered to celebrate an engagement he had called a matter resolved. He stood by the fireplace. She sat because she had learned from her father that the person who sits first in a negotiation controls the tempo, and she had understood from the moment he said the word privately that this was a negotiation. "I will be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "This arrangement was made on sound terms," he said. "Your family's resources are a considerable asset to the Haldane estate." He paused. "I want to be clear about what I require from this marriage." She waited. He looked at the fireplace rather than at her, which was the second time he had avoided her eyes in 10 minutes, and which she catalogued with the precision she brought to anything that mattered. I require a wife who will manage the household and the public obligations of the title with competence, he said. I require someone who understands her place in this household, and who will not. He stopped. The fire moved. He started again. Who will conduct herself with the dignity the position demands, and who will understand that the private life of this house is not a subject for. He stopped again. She watched him fail to finish 2 sentences in a row, and understood, with the clarity she brought to unbalanced ledgers and contracts with missing clauses, that the blank spaces in his language were not about her. They were about the woman who had previously occupied them. "Your first wife," she said. Something crossed his face. It was there for less than a second, but she saw it. Not anger. It was the particular devastation of a man who had trusted completely and had been made to look foolish for it, and who had rebuilt his entire understanding of marriage around the guarantee that it would never happen again. This man was carrying a shipwreck and calling it a policy. "Yes," he said. He recovered the composure. "Lady Margot and I were not. The marriage did not." He stopped a third time. "She did not conduct herself in the manner the position required," he said finally, and the sentence was so carefully constructed that it said almost nothing and revealed almost everything. Corisande looked at the bookshelves. She looked at the half-finished letter on the desk. She looked at the man standing by the fireplace, who had just explained, without any awareness that he had done so, that he was not offering her a marriage. He was offering her a role in the management of his recovery. She thought about what it meant to be selected for a position, because your family had mills and your father had taught you accounts, and to be warned before the wedding that the position came with restrictions built from another woman's wreckage. She thought about the word conduct and the phrase her place, and what they meant when a duke said them to a woman he had not yet married and believed he was being generous by saying them in advance. She stood. He looked up. "Thank you for your candor, your grace," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected this conversation to go differently, though she suspected he could not have said how. She walked to the door of the library. She did not hurry. She placed her hand on the handle and turned back to him and held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to say everything and short enough to leave before any of it required a response. Then she opened the door and walked through it, and closed it behind her with the quiet, deliberate precision of a woman who understood that the way you leave a room tells a man more than anything you could say inside it. She collected her father from the drawing room with the composed efficiency of a woman concluding her business. Lady Atherstone, mid-sentence with the vicar's wife, stopped speaking and watched Corisande cross the room with the expression of a woman watching a schedule collapse. Her father, who had spent his daughter's entire life paying close attention to her and had developed an infallible understanding of her silences, set down his glass and followed her without a word. They were in the borrowed carriage and through the Haldane gates before the drawing room had fully registered what had happened. Her father said nothing until they reached the Bridmore Road. He looked at her in the carriage lamplight with the patience of a man who knew that his daughter's silences were not empty. They were full of conclusions she had not yet chosen to share. "Well," he said. "The engagement is finished," she said. He waited. She looked at the window, at the Dorset darkness passing outside the borrowed carriage, and thought about a library with a half-finished letter and a man who had handed her restrictions and called it honesty. "He is not looking for a wife," she said. "He is looking for a correction." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "The man has suffered, Corisande. Lady Margot was." "I know what Lady Margot was," she said. "I also know what I am." and I am not a bandage for a wound he has not examined. The carriage moved through the September dark. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who had watched this particular person grow into something the world was not quite prepared for, and had long since stopped being surprised by it. "What will you do?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she heard it. The sound of a second carriage behind them on the Bridmore Road. She turned in her seat and looked through the rear window, and there it was, the Haldane crest visible in the lamplight, the ducal carriage following at a distance that was neither close enough to intercept nor far enough to be coincidental. Her father looked as well. He said nothing. The Haldane carriage followed them for 2 miles down the Bridmore Road, maintaining the same careful distance, and then turned at the crossroads without stopping, without a message. Corisande watched it disappear into the September night and thought about what it meant when a man who had just been left sent his carriage after the woman who left, not to bring her back, but to watch her go. She did not know what it meant. She was going to find out. Ashgrove House was purchased on the 29th of October, which was 5 weeks after the broken engagement, and considerably faster than Dorset property transactions typically moved, because Corisande Verlaine had her father's solicitors and her father's resources, and the focused determination of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in waiting for the world to catch up. Her father, who had built a textile empire by recognizing when his daughter was making a strategic decision and staying out of her way, said nothing about the purchase until the papers were signed. Then he looked at the deed and looked at his daughter and said, "Ashgrove House." "It is a sound investment," she said. "The house is well built. The land is productive. The river frontage alone justifies the price." Her father set down the deed. "It is 3 miles from Haldane Hall." 2.5, she said, "by the Bridge Road." Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who had taught this person everything he knew about negotiation, and was now watching her negotiate with herself. He said nothing further. She took the deed and placed it in the leather case where she kept documents that mattered, and told herself, with moderate conviction, that the river frontage was the reason. She arrived at Ashgrove in the 2nd week of November with 2 carriages of household goods, a housekeeper she had brought from the Verlaine house in Casterbridge, and an engineer she had engaged in London whose specialty was river structures. The county took notice. November was not the season one established oneself in a Dorset country house. November was for London, for the remaining social calendar, for the careful maintenance of position that kept a family's standing intact. November in the country was for people whose standing was so established it required no maintenance at all. Corisande was not one of those people, and she did not pretend to be. She spent the first week learning the property with the methodical attention of a woman taking inventory. The house was handsome and neglected. The previous owner had let the roof go above the east wing. The kitchen garden had not been properly tended in 2 seasons. And the bridge, the old stone bridge that crossed the River Ash and connected the Ashgrove Lane to the village road, was in a condition that her engineer described as structurally optimistic, which was his way of saying it would survive the winter if the winter was kind, and that winters in Dorset were rarely kind. She noted all of it. She had a plan drawn up by Thursday. The bridge was the problem, and the bridge was the opportunity. It was the only crossing between Ashgrove and the village for a mile in either direction, and it sat, according to the deed, on land that was jointly held between the Ashgrove estate and the Haldane estate, an arrangement that dated to 1752 and had never been formally tested because the previous Ashgrove owners had been content to let the Duke's family handle the maintenance, and the Duke's family had been content to let the bridge handle itself. It wasn't handling itself any longer. She wrote to the Duke on a Monday morning. The letter took 3 drafts. The first was too sharp. The second was too warm. The third was precisely what was needed. factual, specific, confined entirely to the structural condition of the bridge and the legal question of shared responsibility. She sent the third draft and thought about the fact that she had written 3 versions of a letter about a bridge and had not written 3 versions of anything since the quarterly accounts for the Casterbridge Mill, which had involved £12,000 and considerably less difficulty. His reply arrived the following afternoon, which was faster than she had expected. It was in his own hand, not a secretary's, which she noted. It said, "Miss Verlaine, I am aware of the bridge. My steward has raised the matter. I propose a meeting at the site to review the condition and discuss the question of responsibility. Thursday next, 10 in the morning. Haldane." She read this twice. She noted the absence of social courtesy, no mention of the engagement, no acknowledgement that anything had changed between them except the form of address, which had moved from Coruscant to Miss Verlaine, and which said more than any pleasantry would have. She noted that he had written it himself. She noted that he had proposed meeting at the bridge, which was neither his territory nor hers, but the shared ground between them. She sent back, Thursday, 10. I will bring my engineer's report. C. Verlaine. Thursday was cold and sharp in the way of Dorset in November, the kind of morning where the river ran fast and clear and everything was visible for miles. She arrived at the bridge at 5 minutes to 10. He was already there, on foot on the Haldane side with his steward beside him. She approached from the Ashgrove side with her engineer and the report under her arm, and they met in the middle of the bridge, which was the only place to meet, and which she refused to think about as a metaphor. "Miss Verlaine," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy. They were standing on a bridge in November. Curtsies were for libraries and engagement dinners, and she had left both behind. He looked at her, and then at the bridge, and then at the river below, which was running high with the November rain. "The near arch," he said. "The keystone has shifted." "Yes," she said. "My engineer estimates 4 inches since the last inspection in 1812. His steward, a man called Fenmore, whose expression suggested he had opinions about this meeting that he was professionally obligated to withhold, produced the Haldane estate's own assessment. They spread both reports on the stone wall of the bridge and stood on opposite sides and read each other's evidence with the careful attention of 2 people who were both correct about the facts and entirely uncertain about everything else. "The deed of 1752, she said, assigns maintenance responsibility to both estates equally. The Haldane estate has borne the full cost of maintenance since 1790, he said. 62 years of unilateral responsibility establishes a precedent. Precedent is not obligation, she said, particularly when the precedent was established by one party's generosity and the other party's neglect." He looked at her across the bridge wall. "You are very precise," he said. "I was taught by a man who builds mills," she said. "Precision is how things stay standing." Something moved in his expression. It was not the composed one. It was not the guarded one from the library. It was something she had not seen before, closer to recognition than to assessment, and it was there for only a moment before the composure returned. "The repair estimate," he said. "What does your engineer propose?" They discussed the bridge for 40 minutes with the focused attention of 2 people solving a structural problem, and Coruscant was aware during the entire conversation that the bridge was not the question between them, and both of them knew it. At the end of the 40 minutes, he said, "I propose we split the cost equally and commission a single engineer to oversee the work, mine or yours, whichever you prefer." She looked at him. He was offering a fair resolution when he could have cited 62 years of precedent and left her to manage the repair alone. She registered this with the attention she brought to evidence that contradicted an existing position. "Yours," she said. "Your estate has more experience with the structure." He nodded. I will have Fenmore send the terms by the end of the week." She extended her hand across the bridge wall. He looked at it. He shook it with the firm, unhesitating grip of a man who honored what he agreed to, and she noticed that he held it for exactly 1 second, longer than a handshake required, and then released it, as though the extra second hadn't happened. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Good morning, Miss Verlaine." She walked back toward Ashgrove with her engineer and the bridge report, and the feeling of a woman who had held her ground and been met with something she had not expected. She was halfway down the Ashgrove lane when she heard it. The carriage. She turned and saw the Haldane carriage on the bridge road, moving slowly, passing the spot where she had just been standing, visible through the bare November hedgerow for exactly long enough to be noticed before it disappeared around the bend. She did not know if he was inside it. She knew only that the Haldane carriage had now appeared twice at the exact moment of her departure, and that coincidence was a word people used when they were not yet ready to call something a decision. December brought the kind of sustained cold that turned the river ash into a problem. Ice formed along the banks and backed up against the bridge pilings where the repair work was still in progress. She wrote to the Duke on a Wednesday about the ice and whether the repair schedule needed adjustment. She expected a letter in return or a message through Fenmore. What she received on Thursday afternoon was the Duke himself. He arrived on horseback, not in the carriage. She noted this with the attention she brought to details that contradicted patterns, because the carriage had been the thing she associated with him at a distance. The Haldane crest in lamplight, the careful following, the presence without declaration. The horse was different. The horse was direct. She was in the East Field when he arrived, inspecting the drainage along the riverbank with her estate manager, which was not the condition in which she would have chosen to receive a duke. But she had stopped arranging herself for anyone's benefit sometime around the 3rd draft of the bridge letter, and was not going to begin again now. "I thought a look at the ice would be more practical than a letter," he said by way of explanation when she met him at the Ashgrove gate. "It would," she said. She dismissed her estate manager and walked the Duke down to the river in the December cold, with the engineer's report under her arm. They walked the length of the ice line together, and she showed him where it had shifted the temporary supports and where the original stonework was holding, and he listened with the complete attention she had come to expect from him, and asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the problem, and one that told her he had already considered the solution. "If the upstream channel were cleared here," he said, pointing to the survey map, "the flow would prevent the ice from settling against the pilings." "That was my engineer's recommendation," she said. "The work will require access across the Haldane bank." "You have it," he said. "I will speak to Fenmore today." She looked at him. He was studying the survey map with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and his breath was visible in the December air, and he was wearing a coat that was practical rather than formal, which was a detail she observed and chose not to examine. "You came yourself," she said. He looked up from the map. "You could have sent Fenmore," she said. "Or written?" He held her gaze. "You wrote to me directly," he said. "I took that to mean the same courtesy applied in return." She looked at the river. She looked at the Haldane land beyond it, visible through the bare December trees. She thought about a man who had told her what he required from a wife, as though he were listing the terms of a lease, and who had now ridden to her property in December to look at ice on a river, and had said you have it without making her ask twice. "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical matter," he said. "The river affects both estates." "Yes," she said, "entirely practical." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was not the composed one from the library, and not the guarded one from the engagement dinner. It was the one that lived in the space between what he had decided about the world and what the evidence in front of him was showing, and she could see him registering the distance between the two. She offered tea. He accepted, which was the first time he had accepted anything at Ashgrove, and they sat in her study for 45 minutes and talked about the river, and then about the county road assessment, and then about a book on agricultural engineering she had on the shelf that he had also read. Neither of them mentioned the engagement dinner or the library or the 3 sentences he had failed to finish. And the afternoon was entirely practical and entirely something else. And when he left, she stood at the window and watched him ride toward Haldane and thought about a man who was arriving closer each time. January brought the winter assemblies, and with them the enclosed social world of Dorset in the cold months. The same families, the same houses, the same conversations circulating through the same rooms, with the efficiency of people who had perfected the practice across generations. Corisanda had been received by the county with the cautious interest reserved for a woman whose situation was unusual, and whose fortune was undeniable, and whose story, the broken engagement to the Duke of Haldane, was the kind of thing Dorset society could discuss for months without reaching a conclusion it was satisfied with. She and the Duke were at the same dinner twice in January. The first was at Dunmore House, where they were seated at opposite ends of the table and exchanged exactly one remark about the bridge repair across the length of the room, which was overheard by Mrs. Halford and became the most discussed exchange at the second dinner of the month. The second dinner was at Lady Atherstone's, which Lady Atherstone had arranged with the visible determination of a woman who considered the bridge repair a promising development and intended to build on it. It was at the second dinner, the one at Lady Atherstone's, that Corisande first encountered Lord Taviston. He was a baronet of 56 who had been a fixture of Dorset society for 3 decades and who carried with him the particular confidence of a man who had never been required to earn anything and had mistaken this for having deserved everything. She identified him within 30 seconds of entering the room because she had been managing difficult rooms since she was 15 and could read the architecture of a gathering the way her father read a balance sheet. Lord Taviston was the man in this room who believed the social order was a finished document and that new entries were a form of vandalism. The evening proceeded as these evenings did. She talked about the winter planting with the Halfords, about the county road assessment with Sir Reginald Caw, and then with the Duke, who appeared beside Sir Reginald during the road discussion and remained after Sir Reginald was called away by his wife, and the conversation moved without either of them steering it from roads to the bridge, repair to the spring plans for Ashgrove, to a question he asked about the Casterbridge mill she had grown up around. That was the first question he had ever asked her about herself, rather than about the property. She answered it. He listened. He asked a second question. She thought, this is what it looks like when he is not managing the conversation. She thought, I should not be noticing what he looks like when he is not managing the conversation. Lord Taviston arrived at her left shoulder. She had observed him circling for 20 minutes with the attention she brought to rooms and had placed it within the ordinary range of social movement. She was wrong about the range. Miss Verlaine, he said, with the tone of a man preparing to be pleasant in a way that required witnesses. There were 5 people within comfortable hearing. He had chosen his moment. Ashgrove is looking remarkably well, I hear. Considerable investment. Thank you, she said. The bridge required attention. The bridge, he said, and smiled at the people within hearing. Yes. Quite an undertaking for a... He paused with the practiced timing of a man who had spent decades making these pauses do his work for him, for a newcomer to the county. One does hope the scale of the improvements reflects a realistic expectation of another pause, of tenure. She held his gaze. She understood precisely what he was doing. The pauses were designed to insert meaning without accountability. Newcomer meant outsider. Tenure meant she would not last. The entire construction was built to say, you are new money in Old Dorset, and you have exceeded your reach. She was formulating her response, the one she had been building for a decade, and had first encountered this particular species of condescension in her father's boardroom when the Duke spoke. "The bridge repair at Ash Grove," the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the library voice, not the dinner voice, not the careful, composed voice he used to manage rooms. This was the one beneath all of them, the one that carried 200 years of Dorset in it, and understood exactly what that weight could do when applied with precision. The bridge repair addresses a structural failure that has affected both the Ash Grove and Haldane estates for decades. He looked at Taviston with the complete, focused attention that had once been directed at her in the library, and was now pointed at someone else entirely. The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone familiar with the property would know. Taviston's smile underwent a rapid adjustment. "Of course, Your Grace. I merely—" "The county," the Duke said with the economy of a man who did not require volume, "benefits from landowners who take their responsibilities seriously. I believe we are all agreed on that." He looked at Taviston for one moment longer than was necessary, which was the ducal equivalent of a closed door. Then he returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred, and Taviston found somewhere else to be, with the speed of a man who had been corrected in public and needed time to reconstruct his composure. Corisande stood beside the Duke in the silence that followed, and thought about what had just happened with the precision she brought to important information. She thought about the weight of what he had said, and how he had said it, and the fact that he had said it at all. He did not look at her. He was talking to Sir Reginald again about the road assessment, and nothing in his manner indicated that he had just done something significant. She thought, "He knows he has." She thought, "He is waiting to see what I do with it." She excused herself and crossed to the far side of the room, where Lady Atherstone was standing with a glass of wine, and the expression of a woman who had witnessed everything and had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Well," Lady Atherstone said. "He intervened," Corisande said. "I saw. He did not have to." "No," Lady Atherstone agreed. "He did not." She took a measured sip of wine with the composure of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for 4 months. "Taviston will be cautious for the remainder of the season," she said, "which is a useful outcome for everyone." Corisande looked across the room at the Duke, who was still in conversation and was not looking at her. "He said the bridge affected Haldane," Corisande said. "He made it about the property." "He made it about the property," Lady Atherstone agreed, so that Taviston had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood his position without requiring him to make a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused, which is a very particular kind of care. Corisande held her glass and thought about 2 months of bridge repairs and river ice and December afternoons in the study, and a man who had told her what he required from a wife as though she were applying for a position, and who had spent the subsequent months discovering that she was not an applicant for anything. "He was wrong about me," she said. "In the library." "Yes," Lady Atherstone said, "and he knows it. He has known it since approximately December." She looked at Corisande steadily. "He is a man who does his revisions carefully. He required sufficient evidence." Corisande looked across the room at the Duke. He looked back. Not the assessing attention. The other one. The one she had stopped pretending not to notice. She held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the social register required, and then turned back to Lady Atherstone and said something about the road assessment, and the evening continued around them, and neither she nor the Duke said anything further to each other that night. It cost them both considerably. He called at Ash Grove on a Monday morning, 4 days after the assembly. She was at the bridge when he arrived, reviewing the final inspection with her engineer, and she understood that the important conversations with this man were never going to happen in rooms she had arranged. She saw him from the bridge. He was at the Ashgrove gate, on foot, not the carriage, not the horse, just the man himself standing at her gate in the January morning. She did not hurry. He did not appear to expect her to. "Your Grace," she said when she reached the gate. "Miss Verlaine." He looked at the bridge behind her, at the new stonework gleaming in the winter light. "It is finished," he said. "Nearly," she said. "The engineer wants another week for the mortar to set." He looked at her. He looked at the gate between them, which she had not opened. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "At the engagement dinner," he said, "in the library, what I said to you, the manner in which I said it." He paused. "It was not how I should have spoken to anyone. It was especially not how I should have spoken to you." He was looking at the gatepost rather than at her, which was the only sign that this was costing him something. "I came to that dinner with a position that had been formed before I walked into the room," he said. "Before I had met you. A position that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with." He stopped. "Your first wife," she said. He looked at her. "I understood in the library," she said. "That night. That is why I left. Not because you insulted me, though you did, but because I understood that you were not seeing me at all. You were managing a wound you had not yet examined, and I was not going to stand in a room and be fitted into someone else's wreckage." He was quiet for a long moment. The January wind moved through the hedgerow beside the gate. "Yes," he said. "I am not Lady Margot," she said. "I am not a safer version of Lady Margot. I am not a correction or a remedy or a second attempt at something that failed the first time." "I know," he said. "I have known it since December." He looked at the bridge behind her. "You are not a safer version of anything," he said. "You are the most ungovernable person I have encountered in a decade of governing a very large estate, and I mean that as a complete accounting of my situation." She looked at him standing at her gate in the January cold, a man who had walked into a library with a shipwreck, dressed as a policy, and had spent 3 months having the policy dismantled by bridge repairs and river ice, and a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and had purchased it at market value. "You defended me at the assembly," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes, Taviston was." Before he finished the sentence, she said, "You spoke before he finished." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because he was wrong," he said. "And because I was the person in that room most qualified to say so and most responsible for it." He paused. "And because..." He stopped. He looked at the gatepost. He looked back at her. "Because you had already made the case better than I ever could," he said. "I wanted it stated where it could be heard." She thought about this. She thought about the 3 seconds at the library door, the quiet close that had said everything. She thought about what that exit meant now, standing at this gate with this man who had come on foot and apologized without deflection. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The bridge is worth seeing from this side, and I believe I owe you tea." He came through the gate. The tea was in the Ashgrove study. She had chosen the study because it was where she worked, and because she was not going to stage a drawing room for him, as though this were a formal call. It was a man who had come through a gate she had opened, and who was now sitting in the chair across her desk, with the expression that had nothing managed in it at all. Mrs. Fenton brought the tea and left with the practiced discretion of a good housekeeper, and Corisande poured and handed him his cup, and sat back in her chair and looked at him across the desk. He looked at the room. He looked at the desk, which was covered in bridge reports and river surveys and a half-answered letter from her father's solicitor. He looked at all of it with the attention of a man reading a room and finding that it confirmed something he had suspected. "You work here," he said. Every morning. Every morning, she said. The drawing room is for visitors. The study is for work. She paused. You are not a visitor. He looked at her. You are my neighbor, she said, with whom I share a bridge and a river and a recently completed repair. The drawing room would be excessive. He drank his tea. He set the cup down. In my experience, he said, women who have studies, they work in every morning, are either extraordinary or impossible. I have not yet determined which category applies. And which way is the evidence pointing, she said. I have been revising the categories, he said, since approximately the second week of December. She looked at her tea. She thought about the apology at the gate, the one that had not deflected into explanation or sought shelter in his title or asked for anything in return. She had spent 4 months trying to maintain a consistent position about this man and had found the task increasingly difficult, and the apology at the gate had been the final evidence that consistency on this point was no longer available to her. I want to say something, she said, about the engagement dinner. He waited. I understood what you were doing, she said, in the library that night. You were not describing me. You were describing what you needed after what you had been through. She met his gaze. I did not leave because I was insulted. I left because staying would have meant arguing with you, and arguing with you in that moment would have required you to defend a position you held for reasons neither of us was ready to discuss. She paused. Walking out was the only honest exit. He was quiet for a moment. Walking out, he said. She looked at the desk between them. It said what needed saying. I see you. I am not going to argue. I am leaving. He held her gaze. It was the most deliberate thing anyone has ever done in a room with me, he said. I thought about it for a week. She looked at him. What did you conclude? That I had managed the evening very badly, he said, and that you had managed it perfectly. He held her gaze, and that the woman who walked out of that library was not a woman who understood her place in the way I had meant it. She was a woman who already knew her place in a sense I had not considered. Something about dignity and self-possession, and the decision to leave a room before it became something neither person could recover from. A pause. It was not the quality I had been looking for, he said. No, she said. It was a better one. She held her cup and looked at the man across her desk and thought about September and October and November and December and about what it meant to watch someone revise their understanding in real time and to find that the revised version was something she had not prepared herself for. Emmerich, she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and your grace and the careful empty space where his name would go. And now the name itself was in the Ashgrove study, and neither of them could take it back. Yes, he said. I bought this house because of you, she said. Not entirely. The property is sound, and the river frontage justified the price, and all of that remains true. But I bought it, knowing it was 3 miles from yours, and I told myself it was an investment, and I believed that for approximately 2 weeks. She looked at the bridge reports on the desk. I was angry, she said. I wanted you to see me. Not the fortune and the father and the category you had assigned. I thought if I were your neighbor, you would have to see me eventually. He looked at her. That was not a measured strategy, she said. It was an effective one, he said. It resulted in a bridge crisis and a river dispute and an engineer from London. It resulted, she said, in you being here in this study, having this conversation. He looked at her for a long moment. I consider the investment sound, he said. She held his gaze. He stood and came around the desk and stood before her chair, and she stood because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were very close in the Ashgrove study with the January light coming through the tall windows and the bridge reports between them, and 3 months of repairs behind them. "I was wrong about you," he said, "at the engagement dinner in September. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong every day after until I stopped being wrong. And I am asking." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression that had nothing of management in it at all. "I am asking whether I am too late to be right." She looked at him. She thought about the library door, the 3 seconds, the quiet close that had said everything. She thought about what that exit meant now, in this room, with this man who had stood at an assembly and told a room full of people that anyone familiar with the property would know, and who had come through her gate and apologized without a single qualification. She did not walk out. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, and looked at him and said, "You are not too late. You are exactly on time." He covered her hand with his. He looked at her with the full, unguarded attention, the one that had been building since December and was now entirely present and entirely permitted. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the certainty of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and bridge repairs and every true thing she had ever decided, and the study was warm, and the bridge reports were still on the desk, and none of it required any further management. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm and looked at him with the expression she wore when she wasn't managing anything at all. "The bridge," she said, "is repaired," he said. "The river ice is clearing. The engineer's final report. Due next week." She looked at him. "Are we conducting a full property review?" "I am establishing," she said, "that the practical matters are resolved before addressing the impractical ones." "And are they resolved?" She looked at the bridge reports. She looked at the man who had come through her gate and revised his accounting and said it was a better quality about the woman who had walked out of his library and left him thinking for a week. "Yes," she said, "they are entirely resolved." He looked at her with the corner of his mouth, doing something she had catalogued and was now permitted to acknowledge she had catalogued. "You are going to be very difficult to be married to," he said. "Is that a proposal?" "It is a preliminary survey," he said, "before a formal offer. I find surveys useful before committing to significant undertakings," she said. "As do I," he said. "My survey indicates that you are going to find it considerably harder to maintain a policy around someone who lives 3 miles away and has read all the same books and has fixed the bridge you neglected for 60 years. I have noticed," he said, "that my policies have not survived contact with this neighborhood. They have collapsed entirely," she said. "I would recommend starting from new foundations." "I am in the process," he said. He took her hand. Coruscant. Her name. The specific, unrepeatable sound of it. "Emmerich," she said, and this time it carried everything she had not said since September. February in Dorset was the county at its quietest and most watchful. The fields still bare, the social calendar thin, the landscape waiting for the turn of the season, with the patient attention of a county that had been waiting for things for centuries and had learned to recognize when the waiting was nearly over. Coruscant and the Duke were engaged by the 3rd week of February. He had asked formally in the Ashgrove study, again on a Tuesday morning, with the directness she had come to trust, and she had said yes with the same directness, and they had shaken hands on it before either of them registered the absurdity of shaking hands on an engagement. Then he had looked at their joined hands, and she had laughed, and the laugh was small and real and entirely unmanaged, and he received it with the expression she now understood was his version of complete happiness. Her father received the news with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched his daughter buy a neighboring property and had understood exactly what she was doing and had waited with patience for the outcome. The Duke of Haldane, he said, from behind the Casterbridge accounts he had been reviewing when she told him. The man who told you what he required from a wife as though he were hiring a mill supervisor. He has revised that position considerably, she said. He came through your gate and apologized, her father said. Without qualification, she said. And then he sat in my study and drank my tea and told me that walking out of his library was the most deliberate thing anyone had done in a room with him in a decade. She paused. I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his January is everything it should be. Her father set down the accounts. He looked at her with the attention of a man who had been paying attention to this particular person for her entire life and had never once found it unrewarding. Is he good enough for you? He said. She thought about it honestly. He is trying to be, she said. That is the best version of the answer. Her father nodded. It is the best version, he agreed. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon, a letter that was brief out and direct and contained the precise dimensions of the Verlaine fortune, stated without performance or apology. Corisande read it before it was sent and found it entirely correct and entirely her father. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Corisande, not to her father, which told her something. It said, Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow. She read it twice. She placed it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9, beginning with the first note about the bridge survey. She went back to the spring planting schedule with the focused attention of a woman who was extremely pleased and not going to be impractical about it. Lady Atherstone called on Thursday. She arrived at Ash Grove at 11 with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 5 days and had reached its outer limit. Well, she said before she had fully sat down. Well, Corisande agreed. The study, Corisande confirmed. The second time. Not the first. He kissed you in the study. I prefer not to confirm specific details, Lady Atherstone. You have confirmed them entirely, Lady Atherstone said with the satisfaction of a woman receiving information she had been predicting since October. She accepted tea with the composure of someone settling in for a thorough conversation. He was happy when he called on me yesterday. I have not seen him happy in 3 years. He showed it the way he shows everything, very quietly and without announcement. But it was there. She looked at Corisande steadily. You are good for him. He is good for me, Corisande said, which is the thing I did not expect. What did you expect? Corisande looked at the window, at the winter garden, at the lane leading down toward the bridge, and the river, and the Haldane land beyond. I expected to prove a point, she said. I expected to be here and be competent, and make it impossible for him to maintain the position he had taken. I expected to be right. She paused. I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument. What was he right about? That a woman who knows what she is worth, Corisande said, is a formidable thing. He had entirely the wrong framework for it. But the instinct was not wrong. Lady Atherstone smiled, not the social smile. The real one, the one that belonged to a woman who had survived 4 decades of society and occasionally found it genuinely rewarding. Taviston will be invited to the engagement dinner, she said. Corisande looked at her. Because, Lady Atherstone said with the serenity of a woman playing a long game with complete confidence, it is better to have him at the table, where he is required to behave, than outside it, where he will not. She paused. And because the sight of Lord Taviston congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Haldane will be one of the most satisfying things I have witnessed in some years, and I am not above enjoying it. Coruscant looked at her for a moment. "I find I am not above it either," she said. Lady Atherstone left. Coruscant returned to the spring planting schedule and discovered she had already finished it, and was simply sitting at her desk with a pen and the view of the bridge visible in the distance and the Haldane chimneys on the horizon. She thought about September and the library and the 3 seconds at the door. She thought about December and a man in a practical coat looking at ice on her river. She thought about January and the gate and the study and his hand over hers. She thought, "I bought this house as an investment." She thought, "I almost believe that now." They were married in March at the church in Bridmore, the village that sat between the Ashgrove and Haldane estates, which was geographically convenient and socially correct, and which was also, Coruscant had noted when she first saw it in November, a very beautiful church with good stone floors and a window above the altar that caught the morning light in a way that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with the kind of beauty that does not require justification. The village turned out. Dorset turned out. The full county, because the marriage of a duke was an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was a story the county had been following since September. Coruscant walked in on her father's arm and looked at Emmerich at the front of the church and thought about the library in September and the man who had told her what he required and the 3 seconds at the door when she had held his gaze and chosen to leave. She thought about every version of her leaving. The first, the library door. "I see you and I am leaving." The second, at the January assembly, when she had found Emmerich across the room after the Taviston intervention and had held his gaze for 1 beat longer than society required. "I see what you did." The third, in the study, the day he came through her gate, when she had not left at all. "I am not performing for you anymore." She had thought about the fourth version. She had thought about where it would happen and what it would mean, and had decided sometime in February that it would not be a departure at all. She reached the front of the church. Emmerich looked at her with the full unmanaged attention, the expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the library assessment, nothing of the man who had organized his devastation into a policy. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the house 3 miles away and argued the bridge and fixed the river and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She did not leave. She took his hand. He held it with the same unhesitating grip she remembered from the bridge wall. And then he did not let go. After the ceremony, after the breakfast at Haldane Hall, that she moved through with the ease of a woman who understood that this was now her ground. After the conversations with the Halfords and the cause and Lady Atherstone, who had the expression of a woman whose schedule had exceeded even her projections, after Taviston congratulated them with the grace of a man who had no remaining options, after her father found her at the edge of the room in the late afternoon and said, "Well," and she had said, "I am happy," and he had laughed the full, genuine laugh of a man who had decided today was the correct occasion to let it show. After all of it, Emmerich found her in the garden behind Haldane Hall as the afternoon light stretched across Dorset in the long, golden way of March evenings. She was looking at the lane that led down to the bridge and across to Ashgrove, the lane that connected the 2 estates across the river she had fixed and the bridge she had repaired. "The bridge," he said. "It is holding," she said. "The river. Running clear." He looked at her. "Are we conducting another property review? I'm establishing," she said, "that the practical matters remain in order." He stepped toward her. "All of it is yours," he said. "The bridge and the river, and the lane and Ashgrove and Haldane. All of it. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at the lane and the bridge in the distance and thought about knowing her place, and what it had meant in September, and what it meant in March, and how completely a single phrase could turn itself inside out over 6 months when the right evidence was applied to it. "Emmerich," she said. "Yes. I'm going to reorganize the Haldane Library. The system has no logical basis." "I expected nothing less," he said. "And the East Wing needs new windows. The current ones are a disgrace." "The East Wing," he said, with the expression she had memorized and was now permitted to keep, "is yours." She stepped toward him. He met her in the middle of the garden, between the house and the lane, in the March light. She looked at him. She looked at the lane that led to the bridge that led to Ash Grove. 2 estates on either side of a river they had repaired together, and a bridge they had rebuilt, and a boundary they had settled, and were now, in every sense, beyond. Then she said, "The carriage." He looked at her. "The night I left," she said. "September. Your carriage followed me down the Bridmore Road. 2 miles. Then it turned at the crossroads." He was quiet. "And in November," she said, "on the Bridge Road, after the first meeting at the bridge, the carriage passed on the road at the exact moment I was walking away." He looked at the garden. He looked at the lane. He looked at her. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I could not follow you myself," he said. "Not then. I had no right to follow you, and no words that were ready to be said. But I could not watch you leave and do nothing at all." He paused. "The carriage was the only honest thing I could send. It could not speak. It could not ask you to come back. It could only be there, on the road behind you, so that you knew." She looked at him. "Knew what?" "That the leaving was yours," he said. "But the watching was mine." She thought about every version of the carriage. The first, following in the dark. "I cannot follow you, but I cannot let you go unseen." The second, on the bridge road. "I am still here." The third, and the fourth, the absences, the horse, the walk on foot. "I am coming closer. I do not need the carriage anymore. I am coming myself." "I would like to ride in it," she said. He looked at her. "The Haldane carriage," she said. "I've seen it twice from a distance, and never from the inside. I think it is time." He looked at her with the expression that was entirely his own, the one that had nothing of September in it, and everything of every month since. He called for the carriage. It came around from the Haldane stables in the late March light, the crest on the door, the same carriage that had followed her down the Bridmore Road 6 months ago. He opened the door. She stepped in. He stepped in beside her. The carriage moved down the lane toward the bridge, and across the bridge she had repaired, and past the Ash Grove gate where he had stood, and apologized, and out onto the Bridmore Road, where it had all begun. She looked out the window at the Dorset countryside passing in the March light, and she thought about investments and evidence and the way the best decisions were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. She looked at the man beside her, who was looking at her with the full unguarded attention, the one that had started in a December field and was now as permanent as the bridge across the River Ash. She took his hand. He held it. The carriage moved on through the Dorset evening, unhurried and certain, and the road ahead was clear.